When Toyota started hinting that they would be bringing a two-row mid-size crossover to the American market, most folks assumed that what we would be getting would be a two-row Toyota Highlander, very much like Honda did with the Honda Passport or Volkswagen did with the Volkswagen Atlas Cross Sport. But instead, what they ended up giving us was the Toyota Harrier. The Harrier is the Japanese market name for what is now being called the Toyota Venza in North America. But this is not really a mid-size two-row crossover. In reality, you can best think of the Venza as a luxury RAV4, because even though this is nearly 6 inches longer than the RAV4 Hybrid, we have about the same kind of space on the inside and actually in some areas a little bit less room. Perhaps the best way to understand the Venza is to compare it to its very close cousin, the Toyota RAV4 Hybrid. This very blue RAV4 Hybrid is the RAV4 Hybrid that I bought last year. It's actually now about 13 months old, but it is an incredibly close cousin to the Venza. The two vehicles share wheelbases, suspension designs, the drivetrain is exactly the same. Really, the big difference with the Venza is the exterior styling and the interior styling, which is more luxurious and more premium than the RAV4. The best way to think of the Venza really is as the luxury RAV4. No doubt at this point, some of you are thinking, hang on a minute, isn't the Lexus NX the luxury RAV4? Well, the answer sort of is yes, but the current generation Lexus NX is actually the previous generation RAV4, not the current generation RAV4 that's right next to me. This Venza and the RAV4 are exactly the same generation of product. They share the same generation hybrid systems, etc. And in many ways, if you are looking for the most luxurious Toyota-produced vehicle with a hybrid system that is compact-sized, I argue you should buy the Venza over the current generation Lexus NX. If you're confused already, don't worry, because I suspect by the end of this video, everybody's going to be confused. Styling is the big difference between the RAV4 and the Venza. Rather than the mini truck styling that we find in the RAV4, the Venza has a much more flowing style up front. We still have full LED headlamps, but the rest of this front bumper reminds me an awful lot of the modern Lexus lineup, and there's probably a reason for that. Back when the Venza first started, it was essentially the Toyota Lexus RX. That's because Lexus was not sold in the Japanese market, so to sell the same model, they simply stuck a Toyota logo on the front. So it's logical that subsequent generations of the Harrier, although they're no longer related to the Lexus RX, have retained some of those styling cues. As you'd expect out of a style-forward option, the wheels are a little bit bigger in the Venza. You have your choice between 18 or 19-inch wheels, and then if we move on over to the RAV4, you have your choice of 17-inch or 18-inch wheels, so 1 inch smaller. The RAV4 is the boxier and more practical option. The roofline is about 1 inch higher than the Venza, the rear window is more vertical, and it remains a lot boxier right back here in this area. In keeping with the premium theme of the Venza, the rear tail lamp modules are full LEDs, including the backup lights and the turn signals that are down there at the bottom of the bumper. The RAV4, on the other hand, has combination tail lamp modules, which means that the brake lights are LEDs, but the rest of the lights are incandescent. You'll notice that we have exactly the same exhaust tips in the back. Although I don't suspect too many people are going to take either the Venza or the RAV4 Hybrid truly off-roading, you should know that because the front end is a little bit longer, it affects the approach angle, and ground clearance is slightly lower in the Venza. It's not a big deal, it's 0.2 of an inch. Probably has something to do with the tire sizes that the Venza has rather than the RAV4. Other than that, the two vehicles are very, very similar. They even share the same front brakes and the same turning radius. Under the hood, we find exactly the same hybrid system that we find in the RAV4 Hybrid. This is based around the same 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine, and it produces the same 219 horsepower. Some of us in the industry had hoped that the Venza would get the more powerful hybrid system from the Toyota Highlander, which is based around the same 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine, but has things tweaked up to just over 240 horsepower, but unfortunately that didn't happen for the Venza. Fuel economy is pretty similar to the RAV4 Hybrid. Thanks to the added curb weight in the Venza, fuel economy drops by just 1 mile per gallon, 39 combined for this model, 40 mpg combined for the RAV4 Hybrid. Logically, since these two vehicles share an all-wheel drive system, all-wheel drive performance should be essentially the same. The only key difference in terms of software between these two models is that the RAV4 gets a trail mode for the all-wheel drive system, which will try and balance power front and rear a little bit more than we see in the Venza, but the difference is not huge. If the front wheels slip, both vehicles will try and send equal amounts of power to the rear axle. The other difference when it comes to going places that are a little bit sticky is that the Venza has 0.2 of an inch less ground clearance than we find in the RAV4 Hybrid. That doesn't make a huge difference. If you plan on towing with your hybrid crossover, you're probably going to want the RAV4 Hybrid because this has a tow rating of 1,750 pounds in North America. If you get the RAV4 Prime, then that does bump up to about 2,500 pounds. For some strange reason, the Venza has a towing capacity of 0, and that has never been fully explained because the Venza and the RAV4 share basically the same structure and the same drivetrain, so I'm not quite clear why the Venza has no towing capacity and this one has 1,750 pounds more. On the inside, there's a welcome upgrade to the driver's seat versus the RAV4. This has a 4-way adjustable lumbar support rather than the 2-way lumbar that we find in the RAV4. We also have a powered tilt telescopic steering column rather than a manual tilt telescopic column with a 2-position memory over there on the driver's door. The passenger seat is powered in this model, but it does not have a lumbar support feature. One of the main reasons to buy the Edge over the Escape or the Santa Fe over the Tucson is that they're bigger on the inside than the compact crossover. That's not the case in the Venza. Again, remember, this is basically a luxury RAV4. So in terms of combined legroom, we actually find a hair less legroom in here due probably to the design of the front seats than we find in the RAV4 Hybrid. That means that if you were to put a child seat behind an adult up front, it could still be a little bit tight in the Venza. This is one of the tightest back seats in the mid-size crossover segment, if you want to include the Venza there. You also won't find a wider rear bench, and that's another thing that we generally see in those mid-size crossovers, the Murano, the Edge, the Santa Fe, etc. So those are going to be a lot more convenient for 3 adults across the rear or a mixture of adults and child seats. With this front seat adjusted for a 6'5" passenger, it's all the way back in its tracks, and I have only about an inch of legroom left. You will certainly find more legroom in something like that Santa Fe. The rear seats offer the same 2-stage recline feature that we find in the RAV4. There's a padded center armrest with 2 cup holders, and then we have rear seat air vents for the HVAC system. As you'd expect out of the luxury option, the rear door panels in the Venza are definitely nicer with softer materials than we find in the RAV. Because the Venza has the same wheelbase as the RAV4 Hybrid, this sleeker profile that is a little bit more like the Lexus RX, and a lower roofline than the RAV4 Hybrid, we have about 20% less cargo room in the back, nearly 10 cubic feet less than we find in the RAV4. The big difference is this slanted area right here. The RAV4's cargo area is much squarer. That means that you could put larger items, boxier items, and more of those 24-inch roller bags in the back. This was able to accommodate 2 24-inch roller bags fewer than the RAV4 Hybrid. As with the RAV4, the battery lives under the rear seats, and that means that under the cargo area load floor, we have an enormous amount of storage space. For some reason, the Venza does not get the 2-level load floor that we find in the RAV4 that would help improve cargo capacity just a little bit. Instead, it just has this 1 level. However, very clearly, you could use all of this extra cargo space yourself if you wanted to, and there's certainly enough room for a full-size spare tire if you wanted to do that aftermarket. One of the other differences versus the RAV4 can be seen right here on this cargo area load floor. We have these sound isolation panels. We don't find those in the RAV4, and that's one of the reasons the Venza is a little bit quieter. Since it's now time for the exclusive Trunk Comfort Index, I've put on the new exclusive Trunk Comfort Index t-shirt available over at aoamerch.com, and let's hop in and see how this goes. I do love that we have some underfloor storage in the Venza. That really is going to help the score. I also love the fact that you can put a full-size spare tire in here if you want to. That's something that is near and dear to my heart. I did it in my own RAV4 Hybrid. Power trunk also helps here, or power hatch, whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to give this 10 out of 10 points, even though this is a little smaller than the RAV4. The dashboard styling between the two vehicles is quite different as well. Here's a refresher what the RAV4 Hybrid looks like inside. You can see this has sort of a truckier theme, basically like the outside. We have knobs right here for the HVAC system, knobs and buttons for the infotainment system, an 8-inch LCD for that system, 2-zone climate control, and then a lot of practicality baked into this design. There's a storage tray right over there on the passenger side. There's also one on the driver's side to the left of the steering wheel. And then there are a lot of storage areas located right here in the center console. There's a round drive mode knob, an EV mode button, and a trail mode button, because this one has a mode where you can try and command the system to send a little bit more power than it otherwise would to the rear E-axle. Driver's side, the instrument cluster is quite similar. We have a power, eco, and charge gauge on the left, speedometer over there on the right, and then a color multifunction display in the middle. That's a 7-inch variety. You will find that in certain models in the RAV4 Hybrid lineup, but not all of them. This is the same steering wheel between the two vehicles. It's a round 3-spoke design, leather wrapped in here. We find the controls for that multifunction LCD over here on the left side. The infotainment buttons are separated, so we have volume up, down on the left, and then track forward, backward over here on the right. Cruise control buttons over there on that side. Radar adaptive cruise control is standard on both vehicles. Inside the Venza, we have different styling and snazzier gadgets. One of the most interesting is this sunroof that can be dimmed at the press of a button. You can see it transitions very rapidly. This is quite different than the one that we find in the Mercedes-Benz S-Class, which goes dark, but it goes dark very, very slowly. Over on the driver and front passenger side, we still have height adjustable shoulder belts. We have differently styled seats. These are a little bit more comfortable than the ones that we find in the RAV4, and most importantly, as I said before, more adjustable for the driver. The driver's side does get that 4-way adjustable lumbar support. Very different styling going on the front doors, and I think also improved parts quality. Going in for a closer look, we have little metal medallions embedded into that trim that parallels what's going on over here on the dash. Less storage space going on than we find in the RAV4, but we have a much bigger LCD right here in the dashboard. This is essentially borrowed out of the Toyota Highlander, and the software is basically the same as well. This display is optional. If you get the base Harrier, then we do get an 8-inch LCD that's a little bit more similar to what we find in the RAV4. It's worth noting that smartphone integration does not occupy the entire screen, but you can choose which side of the screen smartphone integration is located on. Below that, we have 2 large air vents, and then we have a bank of touch controls. So if you prefer physical controls, you might want to get the RAV4. If you don't mind touch controls, then there's the Venza right here. We have a power button, auto reset right over there, and right inside there you'll find the 2 USB inputs for the infotainment system, Qi wireless charging mat. This is also where we find the auto brake hold and parking button right there. If I pull that back, we find an EV mode button, and then the drive mode becomes a toggle. Essentially the same shifter in these 2 vehicles. It's a pretty traditional design. Sport mode over to the left with the manual gear change option. 2 decently sized cup holders, although they are a slightly different design than we find in the RAV4. This entire section is made from soft touch material, which is a very nice touch. Back there we have heated and ventilated front seats. This center armrest opens to reveal a storage compartment that's basically the same size as the one that we find in the RAV4. We have this little divider right here with some little cutouts because the cup holders are slightly different. They have these little inserts for taller or shorter drinks, and then there's a place to store them right there in the center console. One of the reasons to get the big LCD is that the backup camera and 360-degree camera system are very, very crisp, although this system is not quite as adjustable or configurable as far as those views go versus some of the other cars out there that have 360-degree camera systems. We do, however, get this augmented reality view, which is quite handy. If you're driving forward, you can get a forward camera view with the 360-degree camera on the other side, and then of course the same thing with the backup camera. Out on the road, the luxury RAV4 theme continues. 0 to 60 times are actually a little bit slower in the Venza because this is nearly 200 pounds heavier than the RAV4. This particular model went 0 to 60 in 7.6 seconds, basically the same time as the last Venza model that I tested. 60 to 0 distance was just a little bit longer, 131 feet in this model. That's likely because this is the absolute top-end trim with a little bit more weight thanks to this moonroof and some of the other features that are going on inside. The Venza's extra 200 pounds really aren't that noticeable out on the road, but you will notice when you drive this back to back with the RAV4 that this feels a little bit softer. It feels like it's leaning a bit more in the corners. That's not due to the curb weight, that's due to the suspension design that we find in the Venza. The stabilizer bars, or anti-roll bars, whatever you want to call them, are actually a little bit thinner in this vehicle. It was certainly tuned towards the softer side of things. Then we also have a little bit of additional curb weight. The combination makes the Venza feel similar to the RAV4, but perhaps a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more grown up as well. Thanks to the suspension design, the little bit of added curb weight, and of course the tire size on the Venza, I'm going to give handling a B. Remember that according to Toyota, this is a direct competitor to something like the Ford Edge or the Nissan Murano or the Honda Passport, etc. Vehicles like the Honda Passport have a torque vectoring rear axle that's optional. It's definitely going to make it feel more sorted, a little bit more nimble than this. You could also compare this against some rear-wheel drive options like a Jeep Grand Cherokee, which in certain forms will outhandle the Venza as well. And then of course there are entries like the Santa Fe, the Outback, the Edge, the Blazer, tons of options out there that are going to, generally speaking, have wider tires than the Venza that I'm driving. Now, the Venza is lighter than most of those mid-size alternatives, but thanks to the hybrid system, it's not as much lighter as you might imagine. Thanks to the different suspension tune and, of course, the fact that the Venza is a little bit heavier than the RAV4, the ride quality is a little bit better. So I'm going to give the ride quality an A. Ride quality in the Venza is definitely very comparable to a lot of the mid-size crossovers, if that's what you want to compare the Venza to, but also a decent number of the softer sprung compact crossovers. I do think that the ride quality in the Nissan Murano is just a little bit better than this, and logically something like the Lexus RX would be better than this as well. I mentioned the RX here because you could see the Venza as the less expensive Lexus RX alternative. I like this better than I like the Lexus NX. It feels more modern, it feels fresher, with the bigger infotainment system, etc., more gadgets than we find in the Lexus NX. But then you find the next level of luxury gadgets, goodies, and whatever in the Lexus RX. But one thing we don't find in the RX is this electronically controlled sunroof, which I have to say is really darn cool. If you can see this in the video, you can really see the difference this makes in terms of the lighting. You can really see the difference on my face and shoulders and everything in here. It blocks a reasonable amount of light. Now, it doesn't block quite as much light as the LCD windows that we find in a Boeing 787 or in that top-end Mercedes, but this operates really quickly. So if you just want to see out, you can hit the button, you can see out, all of a sudden you can't see in. I hope that this kind of technology works its way into full EVs that have the big glass roof like the Polestar 2, or of course basically the entire Tesla lineup. This one also has a regular shade if you would rather have this entire area completely covered. Again, another feature that I really like, because sometimes in really strong sunlight, even that more shaded mode is just a little bit too much light. Back out on the open road, this model was a little bit quieter than the last Venza I tested. I'm not entirely clear why that is. The last model that I tested was a pre-production Venza that may have had something to do with that, and this is a full production model. In this model, I scored 71 decibels in my 50-mile-an-hour cabin noise score, so I'm going to go ahead and give this an A when it comes to cabin noise. This is very similar to most of the mid-size mainstream crossovers with which it's theoretically trying to compete. Although we still get some engine noise in the cabin, the engine noise is certainly more muted, and for some reason it sounds a little bit more refined than in the RAV4. That's likely just due to the extra sound deadening that we find between the dashboard and the engine. I know I keep saying this, but it really is true. The best way to think of this is as the luxury or the grown-up RAV4, whatever you want to call it. This drives very much like the RAV4 Hybrid. That's not a bad thing as far as crossovers go, because this generation of the RAV4 has had a serious dedication to improving handling ability versus previous generations. But if you want something that's a little bit softer, a little bit more comfortable, a little bit quieter, a little bit more isolated, that's exactly where the Venza comes in. This versus the Lexus NX, which I think is also a very valid comparison, comes across as more refined, more modern, and just newer. Now, that's not too surprising, of course, because at this point in time, the Lexus NX is about 5 years old. Versus some of the larger mid-size crossovers out there, like the Volkswagen Atlas Cross Sport, this is going to feel a little bit smaller out on the road. It also is going to fit in tighter parking spaces. This is much more likely to fit in some of those narrow suburban or urban parking spaces, and something like that Atlas Cross Sport is pretty wide, and so it is a little bit more difficult to park in some of those older urban areas. Fuel economy has been excellent over a week of mixed driving. In theory, this is supposed to be about 1 mile per gallon less than the RAV4 Hybrid, but in real-world driving, it's going to be incredibly similar. It really will depend on your driving style. If you drive this a little bit more gently than you're driving the RAV4, this will give you better fuel economy. If you drive the RAV4 gently, it will give you better fuel economy. Over a week of mixed driving in about 750 miles, that's a little bit longer than normal because I did stuff a road trip in here, I've been averaging almost 37 miles per gallon in this model. 37 miles per gallon may sound a little bit low for the EPA score of 39, but remember, a lot of these miles were highway miles, and in the highway fuel economy ranking, this model gets below 40 mpg. With a lot of Toyota's hybrids, the highway fuel economy number is below the city fuel economy number, so that means that if you're in a lot of stop and go or slow and go traffic, you should be expecting above 39 mpg, but if you're doing mainly highway driving, especially higher speed, steady state highway driving, in California the speed limit in the roads I was on was about 70 miles an hour, then your fuel economy should be towards the low end of that highway mark. Bottom lining the Venza for me out on the road is pretty easy. This feels like the grown-up RAV4 that personally I would prefer. If I were simply to choose between the RAV4 and the Venza, the slight differences that we find in the Venza would put this over the edge for me. However, I do have to say I really wish that Toyota had given this the hybrid system from the Highlander, because this would have been excellent with an extra 20 or 30 horsepower. And now to the nitty-gritty. The Venza will set you back at least $32,470 plus tax, title, license, and destination. That will get you the absolute base Venza LE model. That's about $4,000 more expensive than the base RAV4 Hybrid. But remember, the Venza does have more standard equipment. Once you've factored in the standard equipment that we find in the Venza, the price tags do get closer together, but you'll still be paying a few $1,000s more for the extra style in the Venza, the more comfortable interior as well. Making things a bit more complicated is the reality that because the Venza is a little bit heavier and tuned a little bit softer, this is not going to be quite as fast as any version of the RAV4 Hybrid, and the fuel economy is going to be also a little bit lower, and handling is not going to be quite as sharp. But the two vehicles are so similar that this really is a shade of gray. Jumping up into the XLE trim of both models, the pricing delta is going to widen out to $6,200 because we get even more standard equipment in the XLE Venza versus the base XLE RAV4 Hybrid. For reference, my very blue RAV4 is an XLE trim, although it does have a number of additional options on it. If you get the top-end limited trim, which is what I've been driving today, then the pricing gap narrows back down to about $2,800 because the feature content becomes a little bit more equal, although you'll still find a few more features in this than we do find in the RAV4. And of course, there are more features available in the Venza, like that dimming sunroof, like the 12-inch LCD instrument cluster, like the 4-way adjustable lumbar support, the nicer interior parts, etc. The model that I've been driving today is an essentially fully loaded Venza. This one came in at $41,900, of course, before tax, title, license, and destination. That's about $2,000 more than a RAV4 Prime X SE, which is interesting, and about $2,000 more than a base Lexus NX. The value proposition between the RAV4 Prime and the Venza is pretty interesting because the Venza again has nicer interior components. We have the larger touchscreen LCD, the sunroof that I mentioned earlier, etc. But the RAV4 Prime is going to give you over 300 horsepower, faster 0 to 60 acceleration, a tax credit, which is pretty huge. It's going to make it less expensive than the Venza. And of course, you have some electric range, which could help reduce your emissions, or of course, just transition some of your consumption over to electricity if you're interested in that. But personally, I think the Lexus NX comparison is a little bit more interesting because honestly, the interior in the Venza is more premium than the interior that we find in the Lexus NX. I find the seats more comfortable as well. That's because the NX is really getting to be old. The NX is again based on the previous generation platform that underpinned the Harrier in Japan. We didn't see that model in the United States. And of course, the RAV4, which we did see in the US. At this point, I don't know exactly when the NX is going to get a complete redesign. When it does, you should expect it to leapfrog the Venza in terms of interior build quality, parts quality, gadgets, all that sort of stuff. But at least for the moment, if you're shopping for a Toyota luxury crossover, I would get this over the Lexus NX. But what about the Edge, the Murano, the Santa Fe, the Blazer, all those other mid-size two-row crossovers? Bottom line, the Venza just is not that same kind of vehicle. It is not a mid-size crossover on the inside. This has a relatively small interior, even for a compact crossover, to be honest, when it comes to legroom and cargo capacity. So if you're looking at stepping up from a RAV4 or a CR-V or a Tucson or something like that into a mid-size crossover, which Toyota claims that this is based on its exterior dimensions, keep in mind that the exterior dimensions do not come with larger interior dimensions. That's the important thing to remember about the Venza. If, however, you're looking at that next step up simply because of styling, because of the feature set, the gadgets, the gizmos, etc., then the Venza is definitely in the running. But the key thing to remember again is the size of the Venza. The Venza is unquestionably going to be the most efficient entry in the mid-size two-row segment in America, but it's also going to be one of the slowest entries, and that's because vehicles like the Honda Passport and the Nissan Murano come with standard V6 engines. Standard turbocharged engines are also pretty common in the mid-size two-row segment, and really just the Outback, the Blazer, and the Hyundai Santa Fe come with less powerful naturally aspirated engines that are going to be in the same performance ballpark as this, but they also offer more powerful engines if you want to pay extra. Be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, and what would you choose if you were shopping in the mid-size segment? Would you honestly be cross-shopping the Venza with the larger interiors that we find in the Santa Fe, the Murano, all those other options that I've talked about before? Or would you be looking at something like a Toyota Highlander as more of the true competition to that, as long as you never used the third row? Let me know down there in the comment section below. Find me over at Facebook, over at Instagram, Twitter, all those other social places. Be sure and check out the new AOA merch store as well. You'll find that over at aoamerch.com, and I'll see all of you later.